On paper, enslaved black Americans were kept alive on just enough cornmeal mush and salted pork scraps to survive. 1,200 calories a day for backbreaking work, demanding 4 times that. The meals in 10 cheap meals black slaves ate to stay alive weren't just food. They were a weapon used by enslavers, who calculated every ration as a way to weaken, control, and break spirits. Infant mortality soared, bodies withered, and hope faded with every bite. Why did some survive these engineered Hunger Games? And how did such deprivation lay the foundation for American food traditions? The answers start with the unflinching reality of the plantation ledger. Plantation ledgers spelled out survival in dry arithmetic: 1 peck of cornmeal, 3.5 pounds of salt pork. These were the numbers that governed life for the enslaved, numbers that looked tidy on paper, but told a story of calculated deprivation. A peck meant 8 dry quarts, about 12.5 pounds of meal to last 7 days. The pork, thick with fat and gristle, weighed out to half a pound daily. These rations were not generous. They were not even adequate. They were the minimum an enslaver could spend and still keep bodies working in the fields. The math behind these rations was as cold as it was precise. Cornmeal, ground coarse and often riddled with husk, supplied most of the calories. Salt pork, tough and heavily preserved, provided protein and fat, though mostly from the fattiest, least desirable scraps. Together, the weekly allotment delivered about 4,700 calories per day on paper, but the reality was more complicated. Spoilage, pests, and poor storage meant some of the meal was lost before it ever reached the cookpot. Fatty pork sometimes turned rancid in the southern heat. What remained had to be stretched to feed not just adults, but children and elders as well, who often received smaller shares or relied on what could be spared. Plantation records from Virginia to Mississippi show remarkable consistency in these measurements. The system was designed less for nutrition than for economy. Enslavers saw each ration as a line item, a cost to be driven down. They tracked every pound, every peck, and cross-checked shipments against bills of lading. Overseers signed off on deliveries, and any deviation from the quota could mean punishment or dismissal. The goal was to keep expenses low and labor output high. If an enslaved person faltered in the fields, the ledger was clear: they had received their due. But the numbers did not account for the grinding hunger that followed. Cornmeal mush, watered down and boiled into a bland porridge, became the daily fare. Some shaped the meal into hoe cakes or ash cakes, baking them in the embers when time allowed. The pork, when it came, was often boiled to soften the sinew, then divided among many. Every meal was a calculation. How far could a handful of meal be stretched? How long could a scrap of pork flavor the pot? The arithmetic of rations was a tool of control. Chronic hunger kept bodies weak and minds focused on survival. The gap between what was provided and what was needed forced the enslaved to find other ways to fill their bellies. Ledgers did not record the hours spent foraging wild greens, hunting small game, or tending secret gardens. They did not show the costs of stunted growth, illness, or the pain of watching a child cry from hunger. On paper, the system was efficient. In reality, it was a daily struggle to turn numbers into enough food to stay alive. Children born into slavery entered a world already marked by deprivation. Medical historians estimate the average birth weight for enslaved infants at just 5.1 pounds, less than most modern premature babies. This number, drawn from thousands of antebellum shipping manifests and analyzed by economic historian Richard Steckel, stands among the lowest ever recorded for any large population. The cause was no mystery. Pregnant women worked in the fields nearly until delivery, subsisting on the same meager rations as everyone else. There was no extra food for mothers-to-be, no rest from labor, no special care. The result was a cycle of malnutrition that began before birth and shaped entire lives. Physical evidence from slave cemeteries and burial grounds confirms the toll. Bioarchaeologists studying remains from sites like the New York African Burial Ground and Catoctin Furnace have documented widespread signs of nutritional stress. Cribra orbitalia, spongy lesions in the eye sockets, appear in the skulls of children and adults alike, a marker of chronic anemia. Many skeletons show stunted growth, bowed limbs, and porous bones, all hallmarks of rickets and other deficiency diseases. Even the teeth tell the story, thin enamel, abscesses, and lines of arrested growth that mark each hungry season. The UPA slave narratives, collected in the 1930s from more than 2,000 formerly enslaved people, echo these findings in lived experience. Many recalled eating from troughs as children, fighting over corn mush with oyster shells or bare hands. Meat was rare, vegetables scarcer still. One woman remembered, "All we had was ash cakes and pot liquor. The babies, they mostly died." Infant mortality soared. Some plantations lost half their children before the age of 1. Surviving children grew slowly, their bodies small for their age, their bones marked by years of hunger. By the time they reached the fields, many had already endured a lifetime's worth of deprivation. The arithmetic of rations left no room for childhood. Each skipped meal, each season of lean, left its mark, etched in bone, remembered in story, measured in the silence of lost children. This was not accidental. The system that weighed out cornmeal and pork also measured out health, hope, and future in the smallest possible increments. Every empty belly, every fragile newborn, testified to a world where survival was uncertain and hunger a constant companion. The legacy of this deprivation would echo long after emancipation, shaping bodies and communities for generations. Night after night, hands that had picked cotton through the heat and dust turned to the earth again, this time in secret. Across the South, enslaved people carved gardens from the margins, planting beans, okra, and collards in patches behind their cabins or at the edge of the woods. WPA interviews decades later echo the same memory. "We worked our own little garden by moonlight. That's how we got greens for the babies." The knowledge came from Africa, carried in memory, and, sometimes, in seeds braided into hair. Okra thrived in the humid air, black-eyed peas climbed makeshift trellises, and sweet potatoes pushed their orange flesh through clay. These crops were more than food. They were a quiet act of preservation. Archaeologists at Monticello have mapped the outlines of these plots, finding traces of peanuts, cowpeas, and even watermelon. Each plant a thread tying the present to a lost homeland. But gardens alone could not fill the gap left by rationed pork and meal. Wild greens, pokeweed, dandelion, creasy salad became a lifeline. Children learned to spot edible leaves at the forest's edge, gathering them in baskets or aprons. "We picked poke and dandelion whenever we could," remembered one former slave. "Mama'd cook it with a bit of salt meat if there was any, but mostly it was just greens and water." Boiling pots simmered over open fires, extracting every bit of nourishment from stems and leaves. The liquid left behind, pot liquor, was prized as much as the greens themselves. Mothers spooned it into the mouths of the very young and the very old, knowing it held the minerals and vitamins stripped away by the rest of the diet. "We'd sop up the pot liquor with cornbread," recalled another voice, "because that's where the strength was." These gardens were always at risk. Overseers might forbid them, or animals might break through the fence in a single night. Yet the gardens returned, season after season, worked in stolen hours. The diversity of crops, okra, collards, beans, sweet potatoes, onions, stood in sharp contrast to the monotony of plantation rations. Each row was a testament to agricultural skill, careful seed saving, and the will to survive. The legacy of these plots endures in the staple vegetables of Southern cooking. Collard greens, simmered slow with whatever fat could be spared, okra thickening the pot, sweet potatoes roasted in ashes. Every garden became both a shield against hunger and a quiet act of defiance, proof that knowledge and hope could take root even in the poorest soil. Nightfall brought a different kind of labor. Once the last embers in the fields faded, hands that had pulled cotton all day turned to the work of survival, quiet, careful, and always at risk. Across the South, enslaved people slipped into the darkness, moving in groups or alone, driven by hunger and the knowledge that what the ration house gave would never be enough. The woods and creeks beyond the cabins became hunting grounds, each footstep a wager against patrols, dogs, and the threat of brutal punishment if caught. Improvised gear was a necessity. Some carried traps woven from scrap wire, others whittled snares from hickory saplings. A few, trusted by overseers or skilled enough to barter for the privilege, had access to battered muskets or flintlock pistols. Archaeologists at Poplar Forest have uncovered gunflints and lead shot in quarters once home to enslaved families. Physical proof that small game hunting was more than memory. The shot size matches the kind needed to bring down rabbits, squirrels, or possums, the animals most likely to fill a pot without drawing attention. Possum bones found in refuse pits tell the rest of the story. These night hunts were not rare, but routine, a steady supplement to the meager pork and meal. Fishing offered another lifeline. Streams and ponds, sometimes miles from the cabins, became gathering places after dark. Simple lines were fashioned from thread or plant fiber, hooks from bent nails or bone. At Rich Neck Plantation, fish remains unearthed by archaeologists show a surprising diversity. Catfish, sturgeon, bass, even turtle, suggesting that enslaved people traveled far and worked together to secure what they could. Lead sinkers, recovered from these sites, signal the use of nets or trot lines, tools that could be set quietly and checked before dawn. These night forays demanded skill and silence. The woods held dangers beyond overseers, snakes, wild hogs, and the ever-present risk of getting lost. Yet the knowledge needed to track game, read animal trails, and move unseen was passed from elders to children, a body of expertise as valuable as any tool. WPA interviews recall the thrill and terror of these expeditions, how a single rabbit could mean a rare stew, how the splash of a fish in a bucket might feed a family for days. The risks were real. Patrols roamed the roads, and any sign of a missing firearm, or even a snare set too close to the big house, could bring swift retribution. Still, the drive to supplement the ration pot outweighed fear. These nighttime hunts were not just about food, they were acts of quiet defiance, moments when the enslaved claimed agency over their own survival. Every possum caught, every fish landed, stretched the rations a little farther and proved that knowledge, courage, and community could carve sustenance from a world designed to deny it. Perhaps the greatest testament to culinary skill on the plantation was the transformation of animal scraps into nourishing meals. Chitterlings, pig intestines painstakingly cleaned, became staples. Preparing them required hours of labor, soaking, scrubbing, and boiling to purge grit and odor. Only then could they be simmered for up to 4 hours, often with onions, peppers, and wild herbs gathered from the margins. What began as refuse, destined for the slop bucket, ended as a savory dish that filled the quarters with the scent of slow-cooked resilience. Pig feet, too, found new life in the hands of enslaved cooks. Tough, fatty, and full of collagen, they needed careful braising to yield their richness. A kettle set over the fire turned sinew to silk, the gelatin thickening stews and lending body to pots of beans or greens. These dishes did more than fill empty stomachs. They preserved African techniques for making the most of every cut, coaxing flavor and nourishment from what others discarded. On some plantations, the kitchen became a place of apprenticeship. James Hemings, who trained in France before returning to Virginia, mentored young cooks in the art of seasoning, timing, and transformation. Under his guidance, scraps became delicacies. He taught that patience and precision could turn even the toughest cut into something worth savoring. Each meal was a lesson: how to render fat for frying, how to season with wild garlic or pepperweed, how to judge doneness by sound and scent alone. This technical mastery was survival science. It meant the difference between hunger and sustenance, between mere existence and a fleeting taste of comfort. The legacy of these cooks, anonymous to history, yet architects of flavor, lives on in every bubbling pot and every recipe passed down in secret from one generation to the next. In the heat of the 1960s, a new name for an old tradition began to circulate through city streets and restaurant kitchens. Soul food entered print in 1964, first appearing in a New York Times Magazine article, and quickly took root in the language of Black cultural pride. The term captured more than a menu. It spoke to a collective memory forged in hardship and hope. Harlem's Sylvia Woods opened her restaurant in 1962, serving fried chicken, collards, and cornbread to a neighborhood in the midst of change. Just a few years earlier, Army and Lou's in Chicago had already been feeding generations of migrants from the Mississippi Delta, their recipes seasoned with stories of the South and the journey north. As the Great Migration redrew the map of Black America, thousands carried family recipes from Georgia, Mississippi, and the Carolinas to new homes in Chicago, Detroit, and New York. Eateries became gathering places, safe harbors where the flavors of home could be found in a plate of smothered pork chops or a bowl of black-eyed peas. The word soul was everywhere, in music, in protest, in the kitchen. It was a badge of identity, a declaration that these foods, once symbols of deprivation, were now sources of pride. Amiri Baraka, writing in 1962, used soul food to answer critics who claimed Black Americans had no cuisine of their own. The phrase spread, first in Black newspapers and then in mainstream media, echoing through church suppers, block parties, and late-night diners. By the late 1960s, soul food was more than a culinary label. It was a statement of survival and self-definition, a reminder that out of the fields and kitchens of the enslaved, something enduring had been created. The food that once meant getting by became a language of belonging, a way to name and celebrate a shared past, and to claim a place in the American story. Plantation records show that enslaved people were often given just a peck of cornmeal and 3.5 pounds of salt pork each week, barely 1,200 calories per day, far below what their bodies needed for survival. This deliberate underfeeding was a calculated tool of control, leaving many with lifelong health problems and staggering infant mortality rates. Yet the evidence: archaeological traces of secret gardens, WPA testimonies of night hunting, and oral histories of pot liquor and hoe cakes shows how enslaved people fought hunger with ingenuity and resilience. Still, much remains unknown. Plantation ledgers rarely recorded the hidden labor of food gathering, and many stories of survival were never written down. Today, foods once born of necessity, chitterlings, collard greens, and hominy, are celebrated as soul food, a living testament to endurance. The legacy of these meals reveals not just a history of deprivation, but a culture forged in resistance and creativity that shapes American cuisine to this day.